Henry McCarty, or as he was later known, Billy the Kid, may not have been perfect, but he wasn't exactly the bloodthirsty outlaw that others during his time became. Looking deeper into his life as a bandit, it's clear that in many cases, he was the victim of circumstance and misfortune. While he certainly enjoyed life on the other side of the law, most of his issues came from being in the wrong place at the wrong time, even at the bitter end. 3 months after escaping his execution, Billy the Kid was killed after being ambushed in the dark at his friend's home. But some historians claim that the truth isn't what it seems. Ever since he left his mark on the Old West, the story of Billy the Kid has been told time and time again, usually exaggerating certain details or filling in the blanks of what may have happened. Sometimes these creative licenses were necessary. For example, what we know for sure is that Henry McCarty was born in 1859 to Irish Catholic parents Catherine and Patrick McCarty, but the exact date and place of his birth are still debated to this day. Even early on, he had very little stability in his life. Henry's father passed sometime before 1870, after which his mother took their children to Indiana. There, she met William Henry Harrison Antrim, and the two were immediately taken with each other, moving to Kansas that year and marrying in 1873. The marriage between William Antrim and Catherine would last a little over a year before he decided that he just couldn't handle it. Part of this was likely because Catherine had developed a severe case of tuberculosis, and soon enough, William ran off. Tragically, Catherine passed not too long after, on September 16, 1874, leaving both Henry and his brother Joseph all on their own. Naturally, he had to make money somehow. Following Catherine's passing, at the age of 14, Henry moved into a boarding house owned by Sarah Brown. Although she provided him with room and board, he apparently needed more and soon turned to thievery. Initially taking only food, he quickly escalated to stealing clothing and 2 firearms from a Chinese laundry with a friend of his. This would be his first run-in with the law. It wasn't long after this early incident that the law caught up with Henry, charging him with theft and finding him guilty. The authorities then incarcerated him, but they underestimated his innate ability to get out of a bad situation. Only 2 days into his imprisonment, he escaped and started his life on the run. After escaping his incarceration, Henry fled to Arizona and found work wherever he could, often on ranches as a farmhand. However, he had already gotten a taste of living outside the law and wasn't quite finished with that lifestyle. Shortly after his relocation, he met a former U.S. cavalryman named John R. Mackey, and the two began stealing horses together. Now living as a fugitive, it was a smart idea to leave the name Henry McCarty behind, which came easily enough for him. Due to his youthful appearance and demeanor, the authorities took to calling him Kid Antrim in connection with his stepfather. Following this, he also assumed the alias of William H. Bonney around 1877. Around this time, his actions began to grow more violent. Henry, now going by Bonney, didn't exactly stay out of trouble, but things got worse in the summer of 1877. Bonney had gotten into an argument with a blacksmith named Francis P. Cahill, who would often antagonize the younger boy. Cahill knocked Bonney down. Bonney's revolver flew out, and Cahill then tried to reach for it. The two struggled for the gun, ending with the blacksmith receiving a fatal shot. Although Cahill was the primary aggressor, and the witness later stated that Bonney had no choice but to shoot him, Bonney knew the law wouldn't see it that way. While he ran away initially, a local justice of the peace named Miles Wood captured him and locked him in a guardhouse until the authorities got there, at which point Bonney had already escaped. He stole a horse and left Arizona. But along the way, Bonney ran into trouble when a group of Apache people took the stolen horse for themselves. Finally, after reaching Fort Stanton in New Mexico on foot, Bonney practically crawled to the home of John Jones, a member of the Seven Rivers Warriors gang. He found shelter there, and Jones's mother healed Bonney as best as she could. Nursed back to health, Bonney left Fort Stanton and headed south, where he again became involved with another bad crowd. He joined the gang known as the Boys and participated in their illegal activities, which mostly consisted of raiding nearby cattle herds. This was one of his earliest moments of publicity, since the Silver City newspaper covered the gang's wrongdoings. Still, he would soon go back to doing honest work. Sort of. Bonnie found more ranch work in New Mexico under an English businessman named John Tunstall, in what used to be Lincoln County. However, Tunstall and his business partner, Alexander McSween, had a problem. An alliance of 3 Irish-American businessmen held political and financial influence over the county, leaving Tunstall and McSween their bitter rivals. Tunstall and McSween were clearly at a disadvantage in their vendetta against the Irish-Americans, especially since McSween owed $8,000 to one of their members, James Dolan. To add insult to injury, Dolan obtained a court order to transfer ownership of McSween's assets to him, along with $40,000 worth of Tunstall's livestock and other property. This is where Bonnie comes into the picture. Dolan's addition of Tunstall's property in his court order was likely a mistake, but Tunstall wasn't about to take any chances. Gathering 9 of his prime horses, he tasked Bonnie with transferring them to his ranch and watching over them until this whole situation blew over. As he could probably sense, something was about to happen. The authorities were still intent on going through with seizing Tunstall's property. Therefore, Sheriff William J. Brady rounded up a group of men and went to Tunstall's ranch, prompting the Englishmen to come out and greet them. This quickly led to an altercation in which Tunstall was fatally shot. Bonnie was not going to let this injustice go. Although none of Tunstall's allies were with him when he perished, many of them witnessed the event from afar, and they wanted justice. Soon after, they and several citizens formed a group called the Regulators, which became more than just a local gang. Sympathizing with their cause, John B. Wilson, the County Justice of the Peace, deputized the group. With this new authority, Bonnie took matters into his own hands. Even though it was the Wild West, Tunstall's demise at the hands of Sheriff Brady's posse was still considered unlawful, and Bonnie tried to do something about it. With a fellow ranch hand and regulator named Richard Brewer, Bonnie spoke to the Justice of the Peace, who granted a warrant for Brady's capture. With their warrants in hand, Bonnie and 2 others searched for Brady and his men, but the sheriff found him first. After a brief altercation, Bonnie once again found himself in handcuffs as Sheriff Brady took him and his 2 companions into custody. And that's when Bonnie's friendships came in handy. Because Bonnie and his companions were acting within the bounds of the law to capture Sheriff Brady, some saw their resulting imprisonment as unjustifiable. Before long, a group of U.S. servicemen under Deputy U.S. Marshal Robert Weidenman, who happened to be Bonnie's friend, came to their rescue. Weidenman freed the Regulators and took Brady's men into custody, but Brady escaped. The whole conflict came to a head on April 1st, 1878, as Sheriff Brady and his men were walking down the street before Bonnie and several other Regulators emerged. A chaotic shootout commenced, during which Sheriff Brady and a couple of his men were fatally shot, and Bonnie received a wound on his thigh. Sadly, this would not be the end of the conflict. Before the fight that led to his demise, Sheriff Brady had spoken with the New Mexico governor, Samuel B. Axtell. Axtell decided that the County Justice of the Peace had been unlawfully appointed, and therefore, his deputization of the Regulators and issuing of warrants against Brady were also unlawful. By a cruel stroke of fate, this meant that Bonnie and the other Regulators were fugitives, so they went into hiding. Now on the run, Bonnie and the others traveled to Lincoln, arriving on July 14th. That day, they spread out and set up in buildings around the town, hoping to evade the law as long as possible. Unfortunately, Brady's replacement had arrived and taken the case, a former Union Army man named George Pepin. By this point, the newly appointed sheriff knew he had become outmatched. George Pepin realized that the conflict had escalated to what could become a full-scale battle. To end the whole affair swiftly, Pepin and his men brought the fight to the Regulators. Bonnie and the rest of the Regulators may have stood a chance. That is, until Colonel Dudley and his men from Fort Stanton arrived at Pepin's request and overwhelmed them with their superior numbers. This event would become known as the Battle of Lincoln, New Mexico, or the 5-day siege. Now on the back foot, the regulators had no choice but to retreat. As they all piled into McSween's house for refuge, 2 of the sheriff's men decided to set fire to the house. Once again cornered, the surviving regulators fled the building, and fortunately for Bonnie, he was able to get away scot-free. However, even though he tried his best, Bonnie just could not stay out of trouble. Bonnie's only confirmed involvement at the Mescalero Indian Agency was that he and 3 others were nearby. That's it. Yet the courts indicted them all for the slaying. This was also despite evidence showing that a constable named Atanasio Martinez had been responsible. To make matters worse, the court retracted the indictments against Bonnie's companions, but not him. This would have lasting consequences. In late 1878, a change in government would finally deliver some vindication to all the former regulators. Well, almost all of them. Lew Wallace, the new governor of New Mexico, decided to grant amnesty to all involved in the conflict following John Henry Tunstall's demise. However, because Bonnie had been indicted since then, he was not eligible to receive this amnesty. The following year, Bonnie and 1 other former regulator once again seemed to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and found themselves in a horrible situation. Back in Lincoln, an attorney named Houston Chapman received a fatal shot on February 18th, and then his body was set on fire. Bonnie witnessed the entire thing. To his credit, he didn't run away this time. Bonnie contacted Governor Wallace to explain what had actually happened. Later, a witness would report that a different outlaw named Jesse Evans had committed the act, and forced Bonnie and his friend to watch the whole thing unfold. Before relaying this, however, Bonnie requested that the governor grant him amnesty in exchange. Not long after Bonnie wrote the governor, Wallace responded, and the 2 of them met a couple of days later in secret. After Bonnie relayed his version of events, Wallace seemed sympathetic and agreed to his terms, under one condition. He promised both clemency and protection if Bonnie would testify before a grand jury. Additionally, Wallace wrote to Bonnie and suggested that they peacefully detain him for his own safety. Desperate for the amnesty given to his fellow regulators, Bonnie agreed both to testify and submit himself for detainment. The next day, he allowed Sheriff George Kimball to take him in. Of course, not everyone was being truthful. Bonnie held up his end of the bargain, testifying against Jesse Evans before a grand jury. But once the authorities had gotten what they needed from him, the district attorney decided not to honor the arrangement and continued to detain Bonnie. But as we now know, keeping Bonnie locked up is much easier said than done. Whether Bonnie was too trusting or didn't realize what was happening, he remained imprisoned for several weeks before realizing that something fishy was going on. He eventually came to the conclusion that Governor Wallace never intended to free him, and once again he escaped from jail on June 17th and fled from Lincoln. Bonnie spent the rest of the year mostly keeping to himself and staying off the radar, until one day when he wound up in another difficult bind. On January 10th, 1880, a man named Joe Grant was fatally shot in Fort Sumner, New Mexico. And, unlike previous incidents, Bonnie was unequivocally the culprit. A local paper reported that, quote, Billy Bonnie, more extensively known as the Kid, had shot Joe Grant, but the story was more complicated than it seemed. According to several accounts, Grant had a bone to pick with Bonnie, so Bonnie approached him at a local saloon. Asking to see Grant's revolver, Bonnie secretly spun its cylinder to fire on an empty chamber, so that when Grant took it back and tried to shoot, nothing happened. Bonnie kindly returned the favor. At this point, he seemed all in on living the life of an outlaw. Later in 1880, Bonnie found another group of outlaws to join through the friendship of rancher Jim Greathouse, who got him in contact with a bandit named Dave Rudabaugh. That November, Rudabaugh and his gang got the attention of Deputy James Carlisle, and later, a lawman named Pat Garrett, who both discovered Bonnie's attachment to them. Bonnie's infamy had grown significantly in only a couple of years, with the Las Vegas Gazette referring to him as Billy the Kid for the first time on December 3rd, 1880. Shortly after, Governor Wallace saw fit to post a $500 bounty for his capture. However, a little over a week later, Pat Garrett found and captured Bonnie along with 3 others, including Rudabaugh. Billy the Kid and the rest of his gang had given themselves up to Pat Garrett. So, while locked in shackles, they traveled with him to Fort Sumner. From there, Garrett took them to Las Vegas, New Mexico, where a large crowd of spectators came to see the notorious outlaws as they arrived on the day after Christmas. We mentioned before that Billy at this point was quite an experienced outlaw, but it's important to note that he was only about 21 years old at this time. As such, he kept his trademark youthful confidence and laissez-faire attitude. When the Las Vegas Gazette interviewed him and asked why he was so calm, he replied, quote, "What's the use of looking on the gloomy side of everything? The laugh's on me this time." Garrett planned to take Billy and the other outlaws to Santa Fe, but something halted their departure. An angry mob led by Deputy Sheriff Romero confronted Garrett, demanding that he give them Dave Rudabaugh to answer for his slaying of another deputy in April. However, Garrett didn't want to lose control of the situation. The deputy and his mob of revenge seekers were all carrying arms, so Garrett couldn't simply turn them away. To avoid the argument turning into bloodshed, Garrett instead allowed the deputy and 2 others to come along and petition the governor themselves for Rudabaugh's release to them. Although Governor Wallace had proven to be untrustworthy before, Billy had no choice but to, hopefully, appeal to his human nature. Being incarcerated for several months, he spent much of this time writing to the governor and asking for clemency. As expected, Wallace declined these requests. Without any other option, it was time for Billy to face the music. Appearing in court on April 8, 1881, the trial against Billy the Kid for the slaying of Sheriff William J. Brady took 2 days before the jury decided on a guilty verdict. Billy the Kid became the only person involved in the Lincoln County conflict to receive a conviction. A few days later, it was declared that he would be hung by the gallows. Of course, the execution was not scheduled to happen immediately. This gave Billy some much-needed time to plan. The judge had set Billy's hanging to happen a month later, on May 13th. So in the meantime, authorities took him back to where it all began, Lincoln County. Despite everything, they still underestimated the kid, especially on April 28th. Taking 5 of Billy's fellow prisoners, Deputy Bob Olinger went to grab a bite to eat, leaving Billy and Deputy James Bell all alone. Fortunately for Billy, Deputy Bell didn't seem the brightest and had no problems taking him to the outhouse at his request. On their way back in quick succession, Billy hid behind the corner, got one hand free of his handcuffs, and used them to beat the deputy before taking his revolver and firing at Bell, who perished instantly. With his legs still shackled, Billy then broke into Garrett's office and took a loaded shotgun that was left behind by Olinger. He waited at the upstairs window for Olinger to come running after hearing the gunshot that killed Bell. Just as Olinger approached, Billy called out to him and shouted, "Look up, old boy, and see what you get." When Olinger looked up, Billy shot him. With those 2 no longer a threat, he found an axe and used it to break out of his leg shackles. After taking someone's horse, he then fled Lincoln for the last time. According to a few accounts, his demeanor hadn't changed, as townsfolk could hear him singing as he rode off. Pat Garrett would spend the next 3 months searching for Billy, who had all but vanished until rumors spread of him showing up near Fort Sumner. Not only that, but Billy had a friend in the area named Pete Maxwell. So on July 14th, 1881, Garrett paid Maxwell a visit to inquire about the kid's location. Pete Maxwell may have been Billy's friend, but they weren't close enough for him to lie directly to a government official. Maxwell welcomed Garrett into his home, and the 2 of them sat together and spoke for the rest of the day. And whether Maxwell gave up Billy's location, it didn't matter in the end, because suddenly, Billy the Kid walked right into Maxwell's home during their meeting, to both of their surprise. The following is the widely accepted version of events. Billy walked into his friend's bedroom, where Garrett and Pete Maxwell were, but by this point in the day, it had gotten too dark. At first, Billy couldn't recognize Garrett, and vice versa, until the kid drew his revolver and asked, "¿Quién es?" meaning, "Who is it?" Knowing that it was Billy, Pat Garrett immediately unholstered his revolver and shot him twice. And thus ends the story of Billy the Kid. Or did it really? Like any infamous outlaw, the circumstances surrounding Billy's demise became legend, and certain details kept getting changed or embellished. However, since then, some have even posited that none of this even happened in the first place. A popular theory surfaced which claimed that Garrett and Billy had become friends, and the lawmen faked the whole incident at the Maxwell house to help the kid get away scot-free. As with most of the kid's life story, the truth might not be everything it seems. Thanks for watching History Exposé. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page Factinate for more incredible facts about everything.